The Last of Us is one of my favorite video game series of all time. In fact, Naughty Dog's grim stealth action horror franchise about a fungal zombie apocalypse, which I know I'm not supposed to say zombies when discussing The Last of Us because the series refers to its shambling hucks of former humans as quote-unquote infected, but let's be clear, these are zombie games. Let's not beat around the undead corpse with a baseball bat like it's a gore-filled piñata here, is a story that has resonated with me both in 2013's original The Last of Us and also with its sequel in The Last of Us Part 2, which I know there is a contingent of fans that really don't like the sequel, but I ain't one of them. The Last of Us Part 2 is fucking great, just like the first one. But regardless of which game, I love The Last of Us series for a multitude of reasons. For one thing, despite being a dark and often tear-jerking story where likable characters meet a grisly demise, the series has an epic fuck ton of heart. In fact, characters, while covered in various shades of morally gray, have charm, are humorous, and can be likable, which allows us to care and fall in love with many of these characters, even despite their less than ethical actions and how tonally bleak the world is. The games give us a reason to care about them. Additionally, The Last of Us series is incredibly gay and has a lot of LGBTQ representation, including a gay man, a bisexual woman, a lesbian, and a trans man. And speaking as a trans lesbian woman myself, it's so awesome to see people like me be prominent characters in genre stories like The Last of Us, because obviously gay and trans people would still exist in the advent of a zombie apocalypse, because obviously. But the best aspect of The Last of Us, the real shit kicker, is in how the story is enhanced just by the fact that it is a video game. See, unlike movies or TV shows, which are passive mediums, i.e. we the audience are spectators of a given story, video games are interactive mediums that require the player to participate in their various narratives. And with The Last of Us, the interactivity is to make us complicit in the violent and grisly actions that the main character is taking, even if those said actions are more morally dubious than J.K. Rowling's Twitter account, because wow, what the fuck? And with the first The Last of Us, the game makes the player accomplices rather than observers. We are active participants in this dark world, which ultimately really enhances the story and the character development. It's what made the game a very unique zombie horror story. Admittedly, this is what I was worried about when it came to HBO's live-action adaptation of The Last of Us. After all, being on television means that the narrative is stripped of its interactive elements, and that the show, even despite being helmed by the talented Craig Mazin of Chernobyl fame and The Last of Us game's co-creator Neil Druckmann, would lose that core and necessary feature of how the player interacts with the narrative, that the transition into a more voyeuristic medium would cause the adaptation story to get lost in the translation. I was honestly afraid that The Last of Us HBO would lose what made the game so special. But here is the thing, The Last of Us HBO is a very good adaptation. Sure, like most high-quality adaptations, there are certain things the show does better than the game, some things it does worse than the game, and some things that are of the same quality, because different mediums have different strengths and weaknesses after all. And while sure, some of the connection to the narrative is lost due to the lack of interactivity, The Last of Us HBO mostly makes up for this by both playing up the strengths of the television medium, which I shall explain in due time, and by being of comparable quality to the source material. It's honestly just a very faithful adaptation, and it's pretty great. This faithfulness starts with the story. Like the first game, The Last of Us HBO follows the middle-aged man Joel amidst an undead apocalypse. And to be clear, Joel is a dude that has been through the ringer. See, on the first day of the infected outbreak back in 2003, the day where modern society collapsed, Joel lost his daughter Sarah, and ever since then, he has been a lost soul. Like a Cannibal Corpse fan forced to attend an Avril Lavigne show. It's just sad. And for the 20 years following Sarah's death, Joel has had to take numerous morally awful actions, like killing people, mostly because the fungal infection known as cordyceps has turned people into fast-moving infected, which caused the world to go to complete shit. Like there's danger everywhere. Whether we are discussing the various types of infected that are more dangerous than the last, or how human civilization has devolved into desperate factions and clans, many of which are violent and or fascistic, The Last of Us HBO's world is a bleak one. If anything, it's one of the few 2023 alternate universes that is worse than the real 2023, which wow, impressive. And amidst that backdrop, for the last 20 years, Joel has just been doing what he needs to do to survive. In many ways, he's a drifter. He's hardly leading a hopeful and loving existence. Things change though when Joel meets Ellie. Ellie is a teenage girl who is immune to the cordyceps infection, something that is unheard of in this post-apocalyptic American landscape, even more so than the concept of good hygiene or healthy physical boundaries. And due to Ellie's immunity to the toxic shroom virus, Joel is tasked with delivering her to the Fireflies, i.e. a rebellious anti-fascist faction, across the country so that they can potentially create a cure to the cordyceps infection. And with that, Ellie is quite possibly the world's last hope at salvation. The Last of Us HBO's story works for a multitude of reasons, but quite possibly the most important positive quality is in our two leads, Joel and Ellie, and how these two characters interact. On the one side, you have Pedro Pascal's portrayal of Joel, a depressed father figure that still hasn't healed from his daughter's death and is a literal stone-cold killer in this post-apocalyptic world. And on the other side, you have Bella Ramsey's portrayal of Ellie, a wisecracking, foul-mouthed orphan with abandonment issues. And at first, these two do not get along. Despite Joel's southern charm and Ellie's humor, the two just don't really like each other, mostly because Joel is very reserved and cold towards Ellie. But throughout the show, the two experience some great and organic character development. After all, Ellie starts to view Joel as a fatherly figure, which makes sense seeing as she never had actual parental figures, and on the flip side, Ellie begins to worm her way into Joel's cold, dead heart to the point that he begins to view Ellie as his kid, as his child, that he is her non-biological guardian figure and protector, which makes sense seeing as this character is played by Pedro Pascal, the man who has now been essentially typecast into the internet surrogate father figure, because between The Mandalorian, Prospect, and now The Last of Us, Pedro Pascal is truly the daddy protector of the realm. And due to both of these well-written characters and the stellar performances by Pascal and Ramsey, these characters find a way into the viewer's heart as well, even despite some of their less than morally ethical actions. We feel a connection to these characters, even though admittedly the source material, the game, has an advantage over the show in terms of Joel's and Ellie's character development. See, in the game, the interactive element really emphasizes our feelings for these characters, which is different when compared to watching the adaptation. After all, when watching the show, the viewer desires for Joel to protect Ellie, but when playing the game, the player controls Joel, which means that we, those of us playing it, feel a need to protect Ellie alongside Joel. In the game, the audience is included and participates in the act of defending Ellie, because when playing as Joel, we protect, we attack, we snap neck. We just feel Joel's need to defend Ellie, whereas in The Last of Us HBO, the audience are just spectators, essentially having less connection to the character. But still, that's not the show's fault. As stated before, all mediums have various strengths and weaknesses, and despite the disadvantage in this regard, the character development between Joel and Ellie in the show remains exceptional. The characters are very endearing, and it's easy to fall in love with them. Yes, even despite how these characters' actions and behaviors will often break your heart at times. Because honestly, the TV show just does a great job here. However, there are things that The Last of Us HBO does far better than the game, and we can mostly see this by looking at the show's narrative structure. See, in regards to the game, the story is very episodic in nature. In fact, the game is divvied up into sections that have their own characters, locations, and plotlines that overall serve the purpose of giving Joel and Ellie reasons to grow closer together, move the overall story along, and also make Joel's and Ellie's escapades feel like an epic adventure. As I said, it's episodic in nature, which is something that the HBO adaptation does in a superior fashion because, you know, it's a TV show. It is inherently episodic. But even beyond that, The Last of Us HBO is able to expand on the game's world building and secondary characters in more detail, mostly because, unlike the game, which focuses on controlling Joel and Ellie, The Last of Us HBO can cut away from our main characters and show supporting characters like, say, Tess, Sam, Henry, Kathleen, or David doing their own thing, and this really benefits the overall story and world building. In fact, to use the Kansas City plotline that features Sam, Henry, and Kathleen for an example, we can actually see and understand why Sam and Henry are fleeing the city more so than in the game. And through the scenes with Kathleen, we can understand why the raiders in Kansas City are so hell-bent on trying to find Henry, which is very different from the equivalent section in Pittsburgh from the game. And with that example, and by extension with the rest of the show, we the audience just get more context that benefits the story and the world building, which is pretty awesome, and that's even before we discuss the flashback storylines like those found in episodes 3 and 7 that feature a lot of supporting characters that, while being secondary to the actual plot, do add to the world building, help establish an emotional connection between the show and the viewer, and let us all see what motivates these characters. Like seriously, the Bill and Frank and the Ellie and Riley episodes just deliver some of the show's most heartfelt moments. And for that, it's terrific, and it's something that the show really does better than the game in many respects. Another thing the show does better is that it doesn't need to rely on action to keep the viewer invested, which is very much unlike the game. See, as an interactive medium, games require the player to interact with them, because obviously. And in terms of the gameplay within The Last of Us, that interactivity usually came through combat or action, like shooting infected, bashing skulls with baseball bats, and etc. Because truly, when it comes to murder, Joel is a fucking artiste. But unlike the game, The Last of Us HBO doesn't need to rely on action to keep the viewer engaged. It just needs to tell a well-written story that sets a backdrop to this world, all while the actors give tremendous performances. And honestly, the show has this all in spades. And that's even before we get to how the action, whether Joel is headshotting humans or firing at infected with a sniper rifle, is impactful and adds to the show's intensity and dark tone. The action complements the drama and the performances rather than overtaking them. It's fantastic. With that being said though, there are a few problems with The Last of Us HBO. Sometimes the missing interactivity hinders certain aspects of the story. The show is missing some of the game's cooler action set pieces, which on the one hand is okay because the show has to be more grounded and believable. Like, Joel can't be racking up kills like it's a literal video game after all, but still I did miss some of the set pieces. I would have liked to have seen more infected in the back half of the season and on Joel's and Ellie's journey, because honestly The Last of Us infected are really fucking cool. And then there's the fact that the show could have benefited from having another episode. While sure, the show follows all the necessary beats to get the audience to care about the characters and the drama, all while being edited in a tight fashion, I would have loved one more episode to expand on areas that had to be glossed over to fit the run times. I would have liked more. But then again, wanting more is a sign that I enjoyed the shit out of this show, because truly, despite some of the issues, The Last of Us HBO is a terrific adaptation. It has the great characters, the subversive story, the interesting world, and the beating heart that made the game so special in the first place, all while adding the benefits and perks of being a television adaptation. It's a terrific outing that made me, a longtime fan, very happy. And even though there will be the inevitable debate over if the game or the show is superior, I'm content in knowing that there are two good versions of this story and property. And it's cool that people who don't play video games can now experience this narrative as well, that they can now see why The Last of Us is so beloved. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of The Last of Us HBO. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you under this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make quick review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.